In this video, I want to look at the battle for Bakhmut. Russia has declared that they now control the entire city, and they're selling this as a kind of big victory. And on the other hand, the Ukrainians claim that they're still in the city, so that the fight is still ongoing. And you get this discussion about who is right, and it can be quite confusing to figure out. So let's talk about it. Over the last couple of months, there has been an intense urban fight in Bakhmut where Russia, and especially the Wagner group, has gradually captured the city. And they have been doing that one house after another. And in the end, the situation was that Ukrainian forces were only present in a small group of high-rise buildings in the southwestern part of the city. So this discussion about whether or not Ukraine is still in the city or if the Russians control everything, it's literally an argument about which side that controls specific houses. So I think it shows how the discussions that we get in the media are sometimes driven by sub-tactical events that really don't give the big picture. Like, what we have seen is that while Russia has taken territory inside the city, then Ukraine has taken territory around the city. So this is not the big counteroffensive that we're talking about here, but it's a local kind of counteroffensive around Bakhmut. But what this means is that I think it's important that we don't understand this as if the battle for Bakhmut is over. It may be entering into a new phase, but it's not over. And what I mean by that is that the presence of both sides inside the city is not actually a requirement for the battle to be happening. It's typically said that the battle for Bakhmut began around August, but it wasn't actually until around January that the Russian forces entered the city. Before that, the Russians were pushing on the city, but they were being repelled by the Ukrainian side. And then they focused on trying to get around the city so that they could encircle the Ukrainian forces. At one point, the expectations in the Russian sort of blogosphere was that they could take maybe 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers into a pocket. Okay, so my point is that we can perhaps say that there has been three phases of the Battle of Bakhmut. The first one was from August and until January, where we only had Ukraine, or where only Ukraine had like a real foothold in the city. And then there has been from January and until May, where we had urban fighting and Russia gradually pushed the Ukrainians back. And now we have a third phase where only Russia has a significant foothold in the city. But all these phases are a part of the same battle for the city, so it's still going on. And I just think there has been a little bit too much confusion about that in the media, where many journalists sort of make it sound as if the battle is over. It's not. And it's possible that over the coming months, we will see things starting to go the opposite way when Ukraine launched their big counteroffensive. Back in May, I made a video where I discussed Ukraine's strategy behind continuing to fight for Bakhmut. And I said that the point was to ensure that the city would continue to be a resource drain on the Russians. Because from a Ukrainian point of view, the Russians could not be allowed to get a pause. And I think what we're seeing still fits that description pretty well. Like, there has been a couple of months where it made sense for Ukraine to use urban fighting to make the Russians suffer big losses. But for this to work, of course, there has to be a good proportionality between the losses. Like, the Russians have to lose more than the Ukrainian side, right? So the way they could achieve that was that they would make the Russians fight very hard for every house in the city, and then they would pull back and they would sort of mine the houses that they left and bomb them with artillery once the Russians entered the houses and these kinds of things. So that way they could inflict big casualties on the Russians and keep their own casualties lower, because whenever the Russians got too close, then they would pull back to the next street and start over the fighting from there. The problem with that way of fighting is that eventually you run out of streets, right? And when the Ukrainians were pushed into a corner of the city and they couldn't pull back anymore, then it's it became harder to keep that beneficial casualty rate. And what we also saw was that the Russians started using incendiary weapons on that last part of the city where the Ukrainians were still holding out. So what this is, it's basically they spread a chemical called white phosphorus over the city, and this creates a lot of fire that basically rains down over the city. It's an illegal weapon according to international law to use that, but the Russians have been doing it quite a bit in the war on different cities. And of course, if you're trapped in a few buildings in a corner of a city and you're under constant fire from three sides and you have nowhere to go, and every night you have these fire bombs being thrown at you, then that's not a favorable position. So it makes sense that the Ukrainians would make that decision to say that they had run sort of out of city for this kind of defensive urban fighting, and that they would instead focus on something else. And I think that's what we're seeing. But the larger purpose for Ukraine with the battle for Bakhmut is still the same. It is to be a resource drain on the Russians. And by starting to attack the flanks of the city, the Ukrainians have forced Russia to send reinforcements to the area, because it would be embarrassing for Russia to lose Bakhmut again in a few months. So they have to somehow stop the Ukrainians from making progress. And the only way they can do that is by taking soldiers from somewhere else on the front line and move them to Bakhmut. And that is great for Ukraine, because when the big counteroffensive comes, it almost certainly will not be around Bakhmut. The city is just not important enough for that. The last thing I want to mention is the fact that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the owner of the Wagner Group, has said that they're now going to withdraw from the city before the 1st of June and leave it to the regular Russian army. On the one hand, I will say that this actually makes sense. Like, it is normal that you rotate forces in and out of a zone of fighting, so they also get some time to recover. So I would say that it is actually, it should be expected that when the Wagner forces had taken Bakhmut, they would need a break and to sort of get rotated away from the front line. But on the other hand, of course, this also means that Prigozhin and Wagner, they get to take all the credit for taking the city. And in the Russian media, they've made a big deal out of this, like comparing it to the Soviets taking Berlin at the end of the Second World War and things like that. So Wagner gets all that credit, but they also get out now so that if the Ukrainians take back Bakhmut over the summer, then someone else will get the blame for losing the city. So that's pretty smart. It will be interesting to see if Wagner actually does pull out. They have threatened to do so before in the beginning of May. But it looks like Prigozhin is serious this time. And as I said, it actually is normal that soldiers will rotate out of an area after intense fighting. So I would tend to think that they're probably going through with it this time. Maybe it was a compromise that was made between Wagner and the Ministry of Defense back then in the beginning of May, when they had that quarrel where Prigozhin threatened to pull out, that if they could finish taking the city, then they would be allowed to pull out. Okay, I will end it here. The most important message was that the battle for Bakhmut is not over. It has only entered into a different phase where the fighting is taking place more around the city than inside it. But the battle is continuing, and essentially it still plays the same role as before. For Russia, it is a largely political project about showing progress and success by taking a large city. And for Ukraine, it's about turning the battle into a resource drain on the Russian forces, which it still is. If you found the video helpful, please give it a like and also subscribe to the channel. My channel actually just passed 100,000 subscribers, which is just mind-blowing. Thank you, everyone, for your support. You're awesome. And thank you very much for watching this video. I will see you again next time.